Film Club podcast, a production of The Commons, the online faith space created by the South Sound Methodist Co-op. But for the purposes of this podcast, we're a bunch of people excited to watch movies and grow together through the lens of anti-racism. I'm your host, Lauren Fontanella, and today I'm joined by Pastor Alexa Eisenbarth from First Olympia. How are you today, Pastor Alexa?
I am doing well, and I'm glad to be here with you, Lauren.
Yeah, we're recording this the week of Thanksgiving. Are you in a holiday mood at all?
I am getting there. Yes, I'm hosting my family for Thanksgiving. And so my house is not quite prepared, but I am excited to do some cooking and spending time with family. And I think once Thanksgiving passes, I will be more eager to launch into the Christmas season, but I'm not quite there yet.
Nice. It was interesting because the movie we watched this week is for the December meeting. It's not like a super Christmassy movie, but it's definitely in that direction, and it's very different from the rest of the media that I'm consuming around this time. I'm not quite in the like Christmas movie mode yet.
Absolutely. Yeah, we picked this movie. Imagining we'd be in December, which is particularly a busy time for churches and pastors, as well as everyone who is preparing to gather with family for Christmas. And so we wanted to pick a Christmas movie, but or something that was lighthearted for December.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was one that came to mind for me. I don't think I've actually seen this whole movie before this week, but it's a movie that I know exists. And we sort of went into this trusting that there would be themes that we could draw from, and that we could come to it with a lens of anti-racism. And we trusted that the film would serve that purpose and would shine some light and be fruitful for us to engage with, at least through this lens. And it was for me. I don't know about you, Lauren, but it definitely was for me.
Yeah, I had never even heard of this film before, which is crazy because the amount of like the way that channels on TV just play every single Christmas like media that has ever been produced every year in the month of December, it baffles me how this completely flew under my radar.
Yeah, I think that's part of our anti-racism discussion. I was wondering while I was watching it, it felt very much like the quality of it felt very much like a Hallmark movie.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, like it has that sort of lighthearted feel that Hallmark movies do. But Hallmark movies, on the whole, are pretty much stories about white people, right?
Yes.
Like there's a lot of white stories. And so, it's interesting to me that this movie does not have the popularity or even just like the frequency, right? It's not shown with the same frequency as like Hallmark movies, as movies, Christmas movies that are like equal in quality, but about white people, and they get a lot more attention than a movie with Black people starring as the main characters. So I found that pretty interesting.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think about that as well. I was watching it because I was trying to evaluate, like, why haven't I heard of this before? Like, I could see, like, if it was a bad movie, but it's not. It's a pretty good movie. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, even for what would be comparable, like let's say Hallmark movies, we're kind of comparing these two. Last Holiday has way more depth of plot and character development than, let's say, a typical Hallmark movie.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it was very enjoyable. But I don't think that the audience of this film was white people. I don't have judgment about that being true, but I have judgment about the fact that in the market, it doesn't like succeed in the same way as movies that are targeted to a predominantly white audience.
Yeah, and we can talk about the production of this film and the way that it came to be made a little further on in the discussion. But I think that the audience initially was intended to be majority white people, and that's not how it's remembered.
Interesting. Well, I'd love to hear what you know about this film,
Ooh,
Lauren.
okay. Well, do you know it's a remake?
I heard that when I was watching it. My friend told me that, but I did not know that when I went into this movie.
All right. Well, I'm going to hop into a description of the film and then we can really start talking about this.
Amazing.
All right. Last Holiday is a 2006 comedy starring Queen Latifah and directed by Wayne Wang. Written by Jeffrey Price and Peter S. Seaman, the film is also an adaptation of the original 1950 film by the same name, starring Alec Guinness of Star Wars fame. This version centers around Georgia Bird, a working class woman who's suddenly diagnosed with a rare brain condition that gives her a 3-week death sentence just a few days before Christmas. Because her health care won't cover the cost of the surgery, Georgia decides to spend her remaining time and entire life savings on a luxury getaway to the Grand Hotel Poop in the former Czech Republic. Or I guess Grand Hotel Poop. I don't have the accent. There, Georgia ticks off many items from her bucket list, such as eating food by her favorite chef, base jumping, and a few luxurious spa treatments. But through a series of miscommunications, she also catches the eye of some other travelers, including the CEO of her old company, who incorrectly assume that she is also fabulously wealthy. Will Georgia's vacation be the final adventure she always dreamed of? Will she be found out by her new friends? Will she ever read Cragen's Department Store magazine? All will be revealed in about 2 hours of hilarious comedic hijinks about a woman secretly prepared to die. This is Last Holiday.
Thanks, Lauren. So at the beginning of the movie, we're introduced to Georgia, and we see her both in her workplace and at home.
Mm-hmm.
And in her workplace, she is portrayed as this very shy and sort of hesitant person who really comes to life in her department, where she has sort of some autonomy and she shares her gifts of cooking with people.
Mm-hmm.
And then we see her at home, and she brings some of that home with her as far as the cooking. We watch her spending all kinds of time preparing food for who we assume is her son, for a child in her home.
I had assumed it was a neighbor.
A neighbor, maybe. Okay, this child in her house. Yeah, I was wondering why she didn't arrange childcare for him when she ran away.
Yeah.
But whatever.
I don't think he lived there. I think he came over for dinner every day.
Okay, cool. So she makes this full fat meal for this child, but for herself only eats lean cuisines.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have this, at the same time, we're introduced to this possibilities book that she has. There was a lot around this introduction of her that I think is helpful to talk about, particularly the possibilities book. So what came to mind for me was a couple of things. One is the line from the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr. about a dream deferred. I think it's in that speech where he talks about a dream deferred. To wait, right? Justice deferred is justice denied. And it seemed like this possibilities book was representative of the dream, the life that she wanted, the life that she would have if she was someone else, sort of, right?
Right.
There was something that was deferring all of these possibilities or dreams for her.
Mm-hmm.
I think in this, zoomed in sort of we're not looking at the wider systems in this movie of the world, but in her story, she has these dreams about her own life that are being hindered in some way.
Right. And if we want to talk about what gets in the way, I think talking about sort of the way this film came to be might be enlightening. So it was an adaptation of a 1950 film that was written actually for John Candy as a starring role. And then he passed away and the script was scrapped. And then Queen Latifah's agent, so the story goes, picked it up and suggested it be rewritten to star her and have it be a vehicle for her. But if you look at the two actors that were chosen, John Candy being a bigger actor, there's another sense of othering about the character if they were going to take him in that same sort of meeker, humble, shy direction, that some sort of infrastructural level society convention is at play, stopping each version of the character from going after the possibilities that they dreamed of.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if I'm hearing you right, so when it was written for John Candy, the only barrier was his own shyness or hesitance?
I don't know. Because I obviously haven't read the original script.
Sure.
But I imagine it would go in a similar direction.
Yeah. I mean, you couldn't help but kind of bump up against those systemic things, right? In the plot. So we're introduced very quickly to her store's manager, who treats her with such disrespect, who answers his phone in the middle of conversations, right? Doesn't actually
Mm-hmm.
listen to her, and says something out loud that I think is always happening under the surface, but isn't expressed out loud all the time. He says, the owner of the company wants to change the culture, and by culture, he means money.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed like this such representative thing, right? It was like a very representative sentence of the larger structure around workplaces, especially like in corporate America. But I think it also reflects and represents like how colonialism plays out in the United States or in our world, right? That there's this attempt to impose something upon other people for the sake of money,
Right.
right? And there's no like there's no mechanism for feedback or for response or for whoever it is that you're imposing this thing on to contribute to the culture of the thing, right? She had such valuable gifts to offer, right? She could cook, and she was sharing this food with people and showing them what this cookware could do for them, right? Like, which would
Mm-hmm.
probably be more effective than the culture that the owner of this store could imagine. But
Well, it's interesting because he tries to stop her demonstration, saying that, like, hey, you're just feeding these people. They come here for the samples and they don't buy anything.
mm-hmm.
Except her department is doing the best out of every department in that entire store. And he's just lying and saying that people aren't coming back and buying stuff because he doesn't like the way that she's doing it.
Right, right. And I think that irony is plays out throughout the movie of that there's this ego or pride in the store owner and manager of like, we know best and we have power and we're going to direct this thing at the cost of everything, but it's just to serve their own ego, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to to continue to build this narrative that they know best and that they have power and can decide what happens, even when the evidence around them shows them that it's not going to go well. Like there's this projection at the beginning of the movie that the fourth quarter is going to be really bad, right? The profits are going to be low.
Right.
And he doesn't listen to that. The owner doesn't listen to this forecast, this prediction, because it comes from a place that he doesn't care about, right? It comes
Mm-hmm.
from a woman who he considers of low status and someone who doesn't have influence in his life.
Right. I mean, it even comes secondhand through a second woman that he also considers inferior to himself.
Absolutely, absolutely. I thought that was really interesting of this the store manager saying the quiet part out loud. The
Mm-hmm.
thing that we don't say, but he made explicit that it's about money. We want to change the culture, and by culture he means money, right? That there's all this coded language. The other sort of system that we see come into place is health insurance,
Right.
and which I just found very pertinent for the current moment. But one being that they don't cover the surgery that she needs that will save her life.
Yeah, and it also seems like it's a very survivable disease. Like if she did get the surgery, she would live.
Correct, right? You'd think that. So, at least in my experience of healthcare, I can generally trust that if I needed life saving surgery, they would give it to me and we'd figure out how to pay for it later.
Hmm.
And even if insurance didn't cover it, like there would be some, I think, push or interest from the healthcare professionals I engage with to save my life. And I guess just trusting that, even if that's not true right now, is a privilege I hold. And there's no advocacy for her. I guess I would trust that there would be doctors who would advocate for me with health insurance.
Right.
And there was just no one who even offered to like fight anything for her. It just was. And then on top of that, when she's like, I'm covered, like I pay my health insurance,
Hmm.
they say, well, if you feel like you're being treated unfairly,
Oh, yeah.
if you feel like you're being treated unfairly, here's our appeals process paperwork. And it was like books and books of paperwork to fill out.
Yeah. And then they were like, and it's going to take 6 months or whatever. And she's like, I have 3 weeks.
Exactly, right? So it's just this like insurmountable obstacle to live, right? There's just this giant obstacle to living and surviving. and there's so many of those things, right? Like there's the corporate America, there's health insurance, this appeals process. There were so many insurmountable obstacles. And I think too, just acknowledging that we find out her salary at her job at the end of the movie. Her boss announces it to everyone to put her down. But in her job working in retail, corporate America, she's making not enough to thrive, right? She's like surviving but she's not able to thrive at all.
Right.
These systems around her create insurmountable obstacles for her to survive and then thrive. Like surviving is just one question and then thriving is another. And there's just a lot of obstacles between those places. So the other piece that I had briefly mentioned was that, she was feeding this young boy these full fat meals and she was eating lean cuisines.
Right.
And so what I saw in that throughout the movie was that these external systems that deprived her of thriving and surviving, of doing well, of enjoying, of pleasure, right? Like of any goodness in life, because there were so many obstacles there, those systems became internalized in her own spirit. And so she also created barriers for herself to experience pleasure, goodness, thriving. And that seemed very represented in food, but also in this possibilities book, right? Like she had dreams, like there are things, and she loved food, right? So, but for some reason, there were all of these barriers that she also created between herself and those things.
Yeah, I mean, to the point where she has that beautiful food in her kitchen and she's not eating it.
Correct, right? She has to find someone else that she thinks is deserving of the food. And she wants other people to eat it and sees it as a good thing, but doesn't see a way to like overcome her own barriers that she creates and society's barriers, right? So the other piece of this is like she has been imposed upon with the beauty standards of white America in 2006, right? And so to eat full fat food means that she will be one step further away from achieving a beauty standard that didn't have her in mind, and that says that she's not beautiful.
I think what's interesting, I think what's interesting is that when she actually gets to Europe and then she orders everything on the menu, it's not seen as like, oh, this greedy person, like I can't believe that she would gorge herself that much. It's like admire that, like, oh, you have the money to do that.
Absolutely.
And it's not like she's like she eats it all. She doesn't waste it. That's like that part of her values doesn't change even when she's ordering a big lavish meal. But like the difference of perceived wealth really changes the perspective on food and the culture around it in the film.
Absolutely. And like what it reveals to me, right, is that there are different social rules for the poor and the rich, right? Like even perceived poor people and perceived rich people have different rules that they're, that they can, how they can behave in society. They're just fundamentally different rules. Oh, one of the examples of this was when she was getting a massage. She was in the spa, and the white woman who was next to her getting a massage started speaking poorly, treating the masseuse poorly. And Georgia, the character Queen Latifah plays, interrupts her treating this woman poorly. She says, I don't like how you're talking to that woman.
Exactly.
And I don't think that if Georgia were perceived as a poor person in this scenario, that would go well for her.
Probably not.
Yeah, like there were things she was able to do and power that she had that she didn't have when she was perceived as a poor person in the movie. And it went really well for her to intervene in this moment. The masseuse was really thankful for that interruption. And this white woman who was getting the massage ended up being her friend and sort of took her correction as she respected her correction,
right,
and was sort of embarrassed by her behavior rather than becoming the stereotype Karen that she could have been, which I think she would have if she perceived this woman as poor.
Yeah.
This is unrelated to what we've been talking about, but the other scene that was really profound for me, I mean, clearly I'm a pastor, but there was this church scene. There's the church scene. And
That scene
yeah,
was like my worst nightmare of
absolutely. And
having like a mental breakdown and having the entire congregation improvise a music number out of it.
sure, right? And I think that I also had this feeling of discomfort in the scene because I am because I'm white, because
Ah.
I am not used to, like, it would be very uncomfortable for me if I were in a space where someone was like suddenly exclaiming and crying out.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't awkward or uncomfortable in the scene itself. What I found really beautiful about it was that in her cries, like, people responded and the entire room changed because of her pain. And
Right.
although that's like mortifying to actually imagine happening for myself, it's also really profound in a way that I think is restorative for her, or I hope is, that it kind of gave me an insight to why Black church and how it functions, like why it functions the way it does. Like that there is this responsiveness because the wider world does not respond to the pain of Black people.
Mm-hmm.
And so to have anyone cry out in a service, it like is acknowledged, and it changes the tone of the room because there is a response and a care and sort of an interest in the pain of the person who's expressing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And over the course of the film, you see a few major changes in Georgia's character, where she comes out for Shell more, and even when she does like crossing the threshold back into the reality of her life outside of the hotel, she still retains more of the confidence and the like, I am going to live life and not just imagine the possibilities of what it could be. And part of that starts in this scene because I think it's the very opening scene of the film is her singing in the choir rehearsal, and the director is like, "You need to be louder. Like you're too meek even in this setting." And then this is where she like takes control of the entire room through her anguish, and it's like the first beginning of seizing the opportunities that her diagnosis has forced her to embrace.
And I think this question poses at the beginning, or this film poses the question, what would you do if you had 3 weeks to live,
Mm-hmm.
right? What would you do if you knew you were going to die soon? And the thing that came up for me was like, oh, she wouldn't code switch anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like she wouldn't do the thing where she has to say the right thing to make white people comfortable, or she would say what she wants to say and speak in the language that she speaks in and how she would say it herself.
Mm-hmm.
It's just something to acknowledge. It's like a sad indictment on our culture, right? And on the systems we've created, that we demand all of this code switching in order to exist and survive in the systems we've created.
Yeah, definitely.
There's also this interesting dynamic that really became clear in the airplane. The flight attendant is trying to correct Georgia, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Georgia has stopped code switching and she's not going to continue behaving quote unquote appropriately. And so she's like, I don't have enough space, right? Like this chair was not made for me and there's not enough space here. And so she was pushing on the seat in front of her, and the flight attendant comes over to her and calls her ma'am.
Right.
And she interrupts this and she's like, everyone's calling me ma'am recently, like what's that about? People were using that term ma'am in order to pretend like they respected her while correcting her and keeping her in line to code switch, right? Like
Yes.
keeping her in line to the expectations of white culture. And so that was just one of the ways she's like, I like saying, right, saying the quiet part out loud of like, this is happening. People are calling me ma'am. But it also made me ask the question, right? What are the ways that I pretend to respect
Oh,
people when
yeah.
I am continuing to uphold like white culture? And I don't know the answer to that question in this moment,
Mm-hmm.
but it's something to consider. Like I don't think consciously I have disrespect for people, right? But subconsciously, what are the ways that I'm like pretending or feigning respect when I am trying to keep people in line to a white culture? Like that is one way I think we uphold white supremacy.
Right.
The other sort of there's a lot of dichotomies in this movie, or
Absolutely.
yeah, just there's a antagonist and a protagonist, and there's sort of these opposites of each other throughout the movie.
Hmm.
And her opposite, Georgia's opposite, ends up being Kragan, who is the owner of the store she works for. It's sort of unclear who her opposite is going to be for a while, but it becomes clear once she gets to Prague that he's her opposite. And one of the sort of distinctions between them is that she commands attention. There's this moment when she comes into the dining room of the hotel and everyone sort of turns to look at her and is curious about her.
Hmm.
When, tables away, there is a senator and a congressman and this owner of this big corporation. And so it should be, right, in the way that the world works in the minds of white people, it should be that the attention is on the powerful, on the table with all the power. And instead, in this room, all of the attention turns to this woman uh, who commands attention.
Yeah.
She doesn't demand it, but commands it, right?
Yes. I think even more exemplifying that is in one of the second dining scenes where
Hmm.
she's made friends with the chef, and so the chef offers her a special table, and even she has to turn down Cragen's invitation to sit at their table of the rich important people. She's like, "Oh, sorry, the chef special table. I gotta go sit over there. Come join me." And even though it's a smaller table, everyone is so enamored by her that they crowd in, and then Kragan has to very reluctantly squeeze in between people because he's not the center of attention.
Absolutely. Yeah, he is so fearful of her charisma. Like the thing in her that draws people to her is so threatening to his own power, right?
Hmm.
Because he demands attention from people. He demands respect, right? He demands those things from people, and because he has to, right? Because he doesn't have the charisma piece or hasn't invested in that, right? He has money, so he doesn't have to have charisma. And so her charisma, the way that she sort of carries herself, the ability to command a room or command attention, is such a threat to power. And we see this power and influence question throughout the movie, but especially when she is with the senator, who is also black, a black man who
Hmm.
is from her community, who is now a senator of her state, and she uses the opportunity this time to influence him. She criticizes his sort of like him sort of selling out, right?
Exactly.
Him advocating for the interests of, white corporate America, and encourages him, influences him to, help his own people get a leg up, right? Like help his own people. I can't remember the language she used, but something about getting over hurdles.
Hmm.
Yeah. How about help your own people over some hurdles rather than helping these corporations get over hurdles in regulatory committees, right? Like what
Yes.
comparatively, what is better for you and for our community. If you think you're helping our community, this is actually how you can do it. And so in this moment, right, she's not a person, like he knows, I think at this point, he may not know, but for some reason he's allowing her, because I think of her charisma, really, he's allowing her to influence him,
Hmm.
when before the only people who could influence the senator and the congressman there were people with money, right? Like they had bought this like expensive trip to Prague in order to influence the congressperson and senator, but it was like the charisma that actually made an influence.
Right. I mean, it should also be noted that the reason the senator's even here is that he was invited in order to be schmoozed.
Yes.
And what he would have been doing is visiting his hometown and listening to the people in the church community. And it's mentioned he has a community center that he's trying to fund, but it's been put on the back burner.
Yeah,
And that's what he would be doing if he wasn't so bought in to the corporate influence.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, so I think there's this thread that emerges of Georgia being a threat. And I think this is an important thing to highlight because I think that it is true and pertinent for this moment, that just by her presence and by her characteristics, right? Like by her race and by like the fact that there's this Black woman from Louisiana in Prague at a fancy hotel eating delicious food and having connections with the chef, that she is a threat.
Mm-hmm.
It's just immediate. And Kragen is suspicious of her, and he ropes in one of the employees at the hotel to like investigate her. Just by her presence there, she is considered a threat. I mean, we see this in in the Black Lives Matter movement of cops assuming that any Black person, even if they're a child, right, that they are threatening.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's like a heightened response, a heightened sense of like fear in interactions with Black people on the side of the police, right?
Right.
She isn't a threat, right, in the way that they think she's a threat.
I mean, to the point where she saves Kragen's net life at the end of the
Right.
film. Like, that's how much not a threat she is.
Absolutely, right? But she is a threat to like the structures. She's a threat to the culture of the thing. She's a
Mm-hmm.
threat to the upholding of white supremacy. She's a threat to influence, right? That she sort of breaks the structure where you have to have money to have influence. She breaks it in this movie. So she is a threat, but not in the way that they think. And I think that's really important. And it reminded me, because I'm a pastor, it reminded me a lot of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the Magnificat that she sings, which is appropriate for this time of year.
Mm-hmm.
Mary, the mother of God, in the Magnificat talks about lifting up the lowly and casting down the mighty. And the Magnificat really talks about this upside down kingdom of God, that the kingdom of God makes the first shall be last, the last shall be first. There's this turning over of the world. I think that Georgia is a Mary character. I think that she sees a world because of this, she has this prophetic ability in her creation of her possibilities book, right?
Mm-hmm.
That another world is possible. And she sort of turns everything on its head throughout through the length of the movie. Things are turned around by the time we get to the end.
Mm-hmm.
This is threatening, right? Like this is threatening to the powers that be. However, I think getting to that moment on the ledge at the end of the movie, the white person, right? Like the white guy who is her antagonist, the sort of villain of the story, still gets redeemed.
Mm-hmm.
I just found it really interesting. It made me ask the question, right? Like, how many people do Black women save on the way to their own salvation?
Mm-hmm.
They don't go alone. And we place getting from here to there, like here to the kingdom of God, here to the upside down world. We place the onus of that on Black women or, Black trans women, like people who have like the least power. And yet their perspective is like this holistic thing where everyone gets redeemed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so powerful and liberative. And I think, yeah. So anyway, it gets back, I think, to the question of who the audience is of this movie. And I'd love to hear kind of how you're reacting to that, Lauren.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the audience that the movie connected with was not its intended audience, which is why the film didn't necessarily do that well at the box office. Like it did fine. I don't know if it recouped its cost, but critically, like reception wise, it was extremely mixed because people didn't like that. They were like, "Oh, this is such an old, tired, like story that like it's a remake of a 1950s film. You didn't really like update the plot wise, and so it doesn't fit in like 2006. But like Queen Latifah's performance was raved about. It was like universally like well received because she brought so much charm and charisma to the character. But I don't think any of the reviews that I read talked about like the anti-racism aspects of the film, and that there's no way the 1950s version had anything to say about most of the topics that we've talked about today.
Mm-hmm.
It's like such a enriched script once you have a Black character in the role that was written for a white man.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's amazing to consider. It reminds me, I mean, in coming to this movie and trusting, right? We were just trusting that there would be themes, right, that we could draw from and conversation we could have and something we could learn without like much knowledge about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think we come to like sacred texts in the same way. And, when I sit down to like write a sermon or, at least to come to the text at first and consider and start mulling over a particular piece of scripture, like I'm trusting every time that there's a sermon. And like that's not necessarily like in any other situation, right? If I were coming to a book, like I can't necessarily trust that there's a sermon there. I trust that there's some nugget of wisdom or truth. I don't know. So with the Bible, at least in my or any sacred text, right? There are a lot of sacred texts. A lot of poems are sacred texts for me in some ways, right? But when you come to the Bible, you're trusting that there's going to be something there for you. The thing we also are, acknowledging, at least in academia, and I hope in the wider church, is that I alone cannot see everything there is to see about a particular text
Mm-hmm.
because I come with my own perspective, my own lenses, my own limits to my understanding of things. And so I need other people to read the same text and be able to interpret it in their way, right? See it through their perspective with their lenses in order for us to get a more holistic understanding of this one piece of sacred text.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that happening here, right? Like there's a text, there's a script, right? And so, a white actor interpreting it versus a black actor interpreting it, there are two completely different products, right? There's two completely different narratives and embodiments of the same thing because two different people are looking at it.
Yeah, and I think part of that sort of community around the texts is
Mhm.
what's great about having this club, being able to hear perspectives that I just don't pick up on because I cannot be everyone and have every experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We need each other. With Georgia at the end saving Kragan, right? Sort of talking him off the ledge, right? I
Literally.
think she communicates like, yeah, we need you too, right? Like there's not this like throwing away or casting off of him, which I think he imagines she would do. Like
Hmm.
the threat of her having influence, of her having like dignity, right? It's not even like influence and power. It's like dignity, having like being a whole person, right? Like just being like
Right.
a character in the plot of things, right? Like her being a whole person, he feels is so threatening to him. That fear of white people, right? The fear of if someone else is a whole person, then how can I be? And like that's not even a legitimate question. It's not a legitimate fear
Hmm.
for someone else to have dignity does not actually threaten your own.
No.
But there's this scarcity right around it that and I think it's subconscious. Like I don't know that people would say it out loud, right? But there's a subconscious fear that if other people have more than they do right now, then I will have less and I will suffer. And it really gets in the way of any attempts at progress.
Hmm.
But at the end, she talks him off the ledge, which communicates to me, right, that she, in her imagination of salvation, right, that in her world, like he still exists, like he's still a whole person. He still has dignity. He still has full personhood. There's not this sort of punishment of him at the end, making him to then be someone who makes no money and suffers. There's
Right.
not there's not a punishment of him at the end.
I think what's also significant about that scene is that even though it starts as we need to save Kragan, it's not really how it ends. Even though like it ends with him coming off the ledge,
Yeah.
the scene in its entirety is not about him because so much more happens, and the film really orients the climax around Georgia. It's not like she gives up the end of her own movie to someone else.
Absolutely. Yes, you're absolutely correct. She still is the main character, which is important, right? It's like it's
Yes.
important to be the main character of your own story, right? And she gets to be. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And all these things sort of come together in that moment. And we like remember in this moment, right? In this serious moment where someone is literally sitting on a ledge, that it's a rom-com, right? Like
Yeah,
that it's still a
right.
rom-com, right? Like her romantic interest has traveled the world to come find her and express his love to her. And her doctor has faxed this message across the miles to change the course of her life for her. So she still gets to be the main character, and it is still a rom-com. It was not going to end in tragedy, and we knew that. But I think
I don't
that
know.
there
I
are
almost
whole things
until
you
about
thought
halfway
maybe.
through the film, I almost thought that she was really dying.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, Kragen didn't jump off the ledge, right? Like that would have been
Right.
how a
Oh, that
tragedy
that
ends,
would have been
right?
a
Like,
bad ending.
yeah, for sure. It would not have been a rom-com for sure. But yeah, so we remember it's a rom-com. But yeah, I think that she, even when she's dying or thinks that she's dying, she still sees a possibility of another world being possible.
Hmm.
And I think we also see this towards the end. She looks at herself in a mirror in the
Yes.
hotel, and she says, next time we're going to laugh more and we're going to live more. And like, we're not going to wait, not that she like thinks, I don't know. She just is like, I would do this differently, right?
Hmm.
If I had another chance. And then she gets one, which is such a gift. But
Yeah, and then she uses it too.
absolutely. Yeah. She uses the chance to be the main character of her own life rather than have like white supremacy be the main character of her own life.
Hmm.
There's also this sort of, I mean, it's not subtle, but like there is a character who you don't see in the movie, and that character is God.
Yes.
Yeah, like God is this character in the movie, and she blames God for her suffering and like what is proclaiming right at the beginning of the movie, like why me, why now, how could this be happening to me, and sort of is blaming God, and throughout the movie kind of is like, you know is this really my story, right? Is this really the story that you've given me?
Right. I mean, even when she wins all the money at the casino, it's like, oh, so, like now my luck has turned.
Yes.
I can't believe that you would allow this to happen when I'm so close to the end.
She's sort of engaging God as like, that God is sort of playing with her life. And she can't make sense of all of the pieces of her story throughout the movie. She keeps like questioning God, like, I'm not sure how this makes any sense. And at the end, she again looks up at the sky and is like, oh, I can't remember exactly what she says, but she says something that sort of gets across like, oh, I understand now, right? Like I
Hmm.
understand how all these pieces fit together, and why you, God, took me on this path that was really difficult, and caused a lot of suffering.
Hmm. If there's one thing from this movie that you want people to take away, because I suspect it's probably most of the members of our club's first time seeing it, what is the one thing that you really want people to either pay attention to or to look out for?
So if you're a white person watching this movie, I want you to pay attention to how Georgia is portrayed as a threat, and just to consider all of the ways in which she is kept from being a threat, or that her threatening presence is sort of managed by the people around her,
Hmm.
or how she undoes it, how she rejects that portrayal of herself. So if you're a white person, that's what I want you to look for. And if you're a person of color, as you're watching the film, I think I would say to look for all of the ways that Georgia code switches at the beginning, and all of the ways she doesn't code switch after she finds out about her diagnosis, and to just acknowledge the invisible forces around us that cause us to sort of manage and control our own behavior in a particular way, and to just acknowledge that they exist. I think that it helps to acknowledge that things are real, that we feel on our bodies and souls. So I think that's what I'd like y'all to pay attention to while you're watching the movie. And then, especially for white people, but I think for everyone, the question that came up for me at the end of the movie as a personal reflection
Hmm.
is to consider what ways our personal or professional goals are destructive of other people.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I have great investment in the United Methodist Church, which is the largest, I think, mainline denomination in the United States. And it is really white. My church is super white. And so I have high investment in an organization that is really white. And that has done harm to people of color. It's done a lot of harm to LGBTQ people. So there are ways that my professional life and personal life, right? Like my faith is personal as well, that are invested in something that's destructive to others.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something to consider and to figure out how I'm going to operate within it or not, right? Like to sort of wrestle with what that looks like, and to acknowledge that my life might have destructive consequences that I haven't considered before. So the question is, in what ways are our personal or professional goals destructive of others?
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for listening to the Anti-Racist Film Club podcast. If you haven't seen Last Holiday, it is currently available on Amazon Prime for no additional fee if you already have Amazon Prime. Also Paramount Plus, but I'm not sure I know anybody who has Paramount Plus. So
I do.
Oh,
I do, Lauren.
ooh.
I know. Fancy.
Very nice. To learn more about the Anti-Racist Film Club itself, visit filmcolly.org or follow the links in our description below. This is a monthly podcast, so be sure to follow us on whatever platform you're currently listening to, such as Spotify, Anchor, or Apple Music, so you don't miss our next upload. But before we sign off, I just want to thank you, Pastor Alexa, for leading our conversation today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lauren, for hosting and doing all the research for around the film. You are vital to this podcast and to the life of the ministry of our cooperative. So thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. I'm terrible at accepting compliments. Thank you very much. That's pretty much all we have time for today and everything I have written down. So thank you for watching and watching. Thank you for listening and happy holidays.